Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel, and for those of you who are new, welcome to you as well. My name is Jennifer and this is my channel. So I'm currently doing vlogtober and I'm trying to find kind of different videos to do throughout the month of October, different from what I usually do. My normal videos are pretty much keto related and weight loss related, and while there will be still keto and weight loss videos during the month of October, I wanted to kind of branch out and do some new type of videos, things that I find interesting and fun. In one of my videos last week, I asked subscribers what they would be interested in seeing from me. And a few people said that they would be interested in seeing or hearing about scary stories, kind of like ghost stories for the month of October since Halloween is coming up, and that is typically the ghost story time of the year. So I'm like all over that because I am loving anything paranormal, ghost related. I live for that stuff. I can often be found listening to paranormal podcasts, watching ghost hunts, anything that has to do with the paranormal, I'm there for. So that's why we're going to title this Mystery Monday. And it's more than just a mystery, it is a paranormal type of story. Not so much scary, just kind of eerie and weird and unexplained. I came across this story actually just a couple days ago. It took place in 1975, and I was born in 1975. So anytime I see 1975, I always stop and check out what's going on and what the story's about. And I'm pretty shocked that I've never heard this story before because it's pretty much a local story. I don't know how far reaching it goes. I don't know how many people out of this area know. Like I said, I'm from the area and I don't even know. So I thought I would share with you guys a story from my area that is kind of spooky and unexplained. So this is a story that takes place in Morgantown, West Virginia. Morgantown is about an hour from me, south, and it is primarily a college town. It's the home of West Virginia University, as well as the West Virginia University Hospital. It's a very large teaching hospital, and it is where people from my area, if you need a specialized doctor, you're usually sent to either there or Pittsburgh, and because we just aren't capable of handling specialized care in my area, so they have one of the bigger hospitals in my area. So this takes place at a cemetery in Morgantown called the Oak Grove Cemetery. And the cemetery is still an active cemetery today. So this is the story of the unexplained unearthing of Harry Spitz. So let me tell you a little bit about Harry and his family before we get into actually what happened. Harry's father was Henry, who Harry was named after, and he was an immigrant from Holland. His mother's name was Desiree, and she was an immigrant from Belgium. Both of his parents were said to be very intelligent and intellectual. They both spoke several languages. Harry's father, Henry, decided that he wanted his wife to stay home, which was the case back in that era. In the early 1900s, the women stayed home and took care of the family while the men went out to work. The only problem with that is that Henry had a heart condition, and sometimes he was unable to work. In different census reports, he was actually listed as not working or working only part-time. So people speculate that is the reason why they lived with Desiree's parents. So in the home, there was Desiree's parents, the grandparents. There was Desiree herself, as well as her husband, Henry, and Harry, the 3-year-old little boy. And the year that Harry died, his mother had another child, a girl, and she was actually born one day before Harry's birthday the year he died. So her name was Irene, and Irene was born on July the 8th, 1912. So Irene never knew her brother because she was just 2 months old to almost 3 months old when her brother died. Harry's family was never able to quite recover from his passing. They mourned the loss of him terribly. His father died 2 years after he did, and many say that he died of grief. His mother continued to wear black dresses for many years to signify that she was in the state of mourning. And his sister, Irene, at the age of 16, decided to cut her hair that was dark brown, dye it blonde, and get a perm so she would look more like Harry, in hopes that that would comfort her mother. After her husband's death, Desiree decided that she needed to go out to work to support the family. She worked in various sales positions where she sold women's consignment clothing, and eventually in 1940 she retired from Montgomery Ward, where she was in charge of the women's department. Harry himself was said to be a very bright child. He was said to be a child prodigy. There were many of the professors from the university will come and visit him on a very regular basis because they were quite impressed with how much he knew for such a young age. In other ways, he was much like any other kid. He loved his toys. He had two favorite toys, a stuffed lion and a wooden horse that he would pull behind him that were on wheels. He was very outgoing, bubbly, and he was just the light of his family's life. At the age of 3, he was diagnosed with cholera, and he died just 8 days after his diagnosis. So now that we know a little bit about Harry and his family, let's get into what happened. Now we're going to fast forward 63 years. On the evening of Tuesday, July the 2nd, 1975, the caretaker of the Oak Grove Cemetery, Glenn Pierce, was making his rounds. As the caretaker of the cemetery, he would normally make his rounds in the evenings to make sure that nothing had been disturbed and there was no more visitors left in the cemetery before they closed it for the evening. On this evening, he noticed one of the graves had been disturbed. And as he approached it, he could see that there was a pile of dirt outside of the grave on the ground. But he didn't notice any kind of tools like shovels, axes, picks to indicate that anybody had been digging or trying to dig up the grave. When he got close enough, he shined his light and he could see that the hole in the ground was the size of a softball, and it led clear down to the cement slab, and past the cement slab he could see that the cement slab had been moved over and he could actually see the coffin inside the grave. This startled him, so he contacted the police. Chief Benny Palmer and Officer Ralph Chapman responded to the cemetery, and they observed the same thing as the caretaker, and they could tell that the dirt was not dug out. Somebody was not trying to rob the grave or disturb it from the outside, that the dirt was actually pushed up from something inside the grave had pushed the dirt up and the hole had opened from the inside out. When Chief Palmer shined his light into the grave, he noticed the same thing. The cement slab from the tomb was slid over a few inches and he could see the wooden coffin inside. So in the beginning at this time, they were unsure of who the grave actually belonged to. They theorized that it could belong to a Spitz family member. The grave was unmarked, but the graves around it were Spitz family members, and they were marked. So they theorized that possibly it could be a Spitz family member. This is when Marion Stone, the secretary of the cemetery, was contacted, and she went through the records and she confirmed that it was Harry Spitz's grave. And she was also asked to call other cemeteries in the area to see if anybody had reported any kind of a disturbance at those cemeteries. And nobody had reported anything being disturbed at any of the other cemeteries. By this time, the news media started to pick up on something going on, and the Dominion Post, which was the newspaper at the time in Morgantown, sent reporter John Blosser to cover the story. Now, there are a lot of pictures that John Blosser took of the scene. Most of them have been sealed and aren't available for the public to see, although I will insert a picture of the grave site as they were digging up the rest of the grave, and it appeared on the front page of the Dominion Post, and I'll insert that here. So after they had figured out who the grave belonged to, now they were trying to figure out how they were going to deal with this. They knew since the grave had been disturbed and the cement slab had been moved, they were going to have to dig up the rest of the grave and reposition the slab and seal it off again. But they were unsure if they were going to have to get court orders to have the grave exhumed, since it was, there's laws to all of this stuff. So they were determined that they didn't need a court order, that because the grave had already been partially disturbed and exhumed, that they could go ahead and dig the rest of it up and re-enter it into the ground. They brought in equipment and they dug it up, and the cement slab was definitely unsealed on all the corners, and it was slid over a few inches. So the police chief decided that because this was the case, he wanted to make sure that everything inside the casket was still intact and that nobody had tried to steal anything from inside of it. So he asked that the coffin be opened. This is where things start to get even more weird, if they weren't weird already. So when they opened the coffin, everybody was taken back and pretty scared, because they had never seen anything like this before. It had been 63 years since Harry had died, yet inside the coffin, he was perfectly preserved. His blonde hair was still curly and intact. His blue satin suit that he was buried in was still intact. His hands were still grasping a flower that had wilted and died. At his feet, there was a stuffed lion, his favorite little stuffed lion that he was buried with, which was still completely intact. And this was very unheard of, because after 63 years, there should have been hardly anything left inside that coffin. One of the theories of how this could have happened was the buildup of gas inside the coffin. Now, it's kind of gross, but it is part of human nature that after you die, of course, your body stops functioning, but there is still bacteria inside your body that continues to live on. The bacteria doesn't die just because your body does. And this bacteria starts feeding on your body and the intestines, and as it does, it emits a gas. And sometimes it's possible for the gas to build up and a pop to occur inside of the casket when the pressure gets high enough. They quickly shot down this theory for a couple of reasons. First of all, it had been 63 years, and after 63 years, that was way long enough for something like this to have happened. It would have happened within like the first year or months after his passing. Second of all, because he was such a young child and so small, there wouldn't have been enough for the bacteria to feed on to cause enough of a pop or explosion to push the concrete slab out of the way, as well as all the dirt out of the ground. And this was a perfect circle, a perfect hole in the ground that led clear down to the coffin. So those two theories were completely shot down of how that could have happened. So another theory was methane gas from mining. West Virginia is known to have many mines. Even in my area, we have many mines and abandoned mines. But that theory was shot down as well, because first, there was no mining going on in that area. And even if the gas had built up from a mine, when a mine subsides, when you have sinkage from a mine, it will go down, not come up. So that was out of the question. So they just didn't have any answers of how this happened. Second of all, they just didn't have any answers of how his body was so well preserved. Now, Harry died of cholera. And so they had researchers from the university come in and take samples of his skin, hair, and nails to test it. So when the tests come back, it was determined that Harry didn't just die of plain cholera, it was cholera infantum. And cholera infantum is something that primarily affects young children and primarily happened in the summer to early fall when it was hot. And it affected the intestines, and it was an intestinal disease. And of course, it was very fast acting. He was diagnosed and died within 8 days. So before they realized it was not just cholera, they were concerned about the people who had exhumed the grave and who were near the body. and they had everybody bathe in Lysol that evening because they weren't sure of if this was contagious, if they were going to catch something, since the body was so well preserved. But since the body was so well preserved and it was in that environment and it was an enclosed area, after they exhumed the body, after it was taken out of the coffin, the body was never actually taken out of the coffin, but when the fresh air started hitting the body, it was out of the environment it had been in for 63 years. The body of Harry started decomposing very quickly, and it turned into mostly just dust by the time that they re-entered his body into the ground. So in July of 1975, when this happened, Mrs. Spitz was still alive. She was 91 years old, and she was in a hospital. She was actually at the Hope Mount State Hospital in Morgantown, but she was in very bad condition. She hadn't spoken or moved in many years, and she was in need of total care. She was bedbound, of course, because she didn't speak, didn't move, didn't do anything. And they decided that since she was in such bad shape that they weren't even going to try to tell her what happened because they didn't want to upset her. And now things are going to get really weird. So as I said, for many years, Mrs. Spitz had not talked. She had not moved, she had not got out of bed, she had not eaten anything for quite a few years. I'm not sure exactly how many years it was. On the evening that this happened, Mrs. Spitz began to talk. Her first words that she said was, "Harry's coming home." And from that evening on, she started talking about Harry, how much she missed her son. She would cry. She would cry like a baby, and she would cry uncontrollably. Also on that evening, when her caretakers came in to care for her, they found that the furniture in her hospital room had been rearranged. And it was impossible for Mrs. Spitz to have gotten out of bed to rearrange that furniture. She was 91 years old. She hadn't been out of bed in some time, so she wasn't physically able to rearrange the furniture. The nurses questioned all the other workers in the hospital on that wing, and none of them reported changing the furniture at all. Over the next few years, the furniture would change and rearrange itself during different times of the year with no warning. Also, nurses in the wing where she was reported seeing apparitions coming from her room, as well as hearing a baby crying. A psychic from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was called. I'm not sure who contacted her, but somebody contacted her, and I guess she was a very well-known psychic from the area, and her name is Midge Frams, and she was asked to come in to give her opinion on what was going on. So it was the opinion of the psychic that Mrs. Spitz created a love bond with her son, and that she was never able to let go of his spirit, let go of his passing, and she mourned him so horribly and so badly that it kept his spirit earthbound. And his spirit remained in the grave with his body. That's why his body stayed intact, his spirit remained earthbound. And it was a buildup of his spirit needing to be set free. And on the evening of July 2nd, 1975, Mrs. Spitz finally was able to let go of her grief and let him go and rest in peace. And it was his spirit that burst free from the grave and disrupted the grave. And why she started talking about Harry's coming home, because now she missed him, because she let him go and he was able to go free. And she cried and mourned because she was no longer had that bond with him. So now Mrs. Spitz has passed, but the stories of seeing her and her mourning have not. In the years since her passing, it has been reported at the Oak Grove Cemetery, where she is buried, as well as her son and her husband and other family members, that oftentimes there is seen a child playing with blonde curly hair pulling a wooden horse behind him. A lot of times that there is an older woman that follows him around. A lot of people that are visiting the graveyard, seeing their loved ones, have reported seeing this, as well as still at the nursing home or the hospital where Mrs. Spitz was, they still hear crying of a child and Mrs. Spitz crying as well. So that's the story of the unearthing. Nobody knows to this day if it really was a paranormal spiritual act that unearthed the ground, or what really caused the earth to become displaced. And the actual, you can go online to hear the reporter that was at the scene that day. I think that there are, the police chief is also interviewed. There are still people to this day that are still living that give accounts to what happened. And I will leave a link to where you can listen to that broadcast of the interview they have of that. It's very interesting, and some things we will never know the answers to. It's just one of those paranormal do things that we'll just always wonder about. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I enjoyed telling you, and I will, if you guys did enjoy it, I will maybe do another paranormal story or scary story in the future. So let me know what you guys think.